The auction house on Grantham Row had survived 2 world wars, 3 recessions, and a fire that nearly took the whole block with it. But on a quiet Thursday morning, it almost didn't survive one careless intern with a rolling cart. Before we get into this story, if you believe quiet people deserve loud justice, take a second to like this video, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Hidden Justice so you never miss a story like this one. Daniel Whitlock had built his life around things other people had given up on. He restored antique clocks and mechanical instruments out of a converted garage. Behind his rented duplex, the kind of work that took steady hands, a magnifying loupe, and more patience than most people had left in them by their 30s. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their daughter Ivy alone, a sharp, curious 7-year-old who liked to sit on a stool beside his workbench and hand him tiny screws like a surgical assistant. Money was never easy. The rent was always a week behind, but Ivy never went to bed without a story, and Daniel never missed a single one of her school recitals, even when it meant closing the shop early and losing a day's pay. Across town, in a glass tower that looked down on streets like his, Vivian Ashford ran Ashford & Cole, the auction house her grandfather built from nothing, and her father had turned into an empire. She had inherited the company 2 years earlier at 31, and she ran it the way she'd been taught, with precision, distance, and absolutely no room for sentiment. Employees respected her. Almost nobody liked her. And that intern's careless. Cart had just crashed into the single most valuable item in the building. It was a 19th century astronomical clock, hand-built by a master craftsman, whose remaining works numbered fewer than a dozen in the entire world. It was the centerpiece of Ashford & Cole's biggest gala in a decade, scheduled to headline an auction worth an estimated $40 million in 18 days. The internal escapement was shattered. The gilded face was cracked. And every specialist Vivian's assistant called said the same thing. Impossible. Nobody could rebuild something like that in 18 days, not without butchering the piece and destroying its authenticity forever. That's when her head appraiser mentioned a name Vivian had never heard. Daniel Whitlock. Vivian almost laughed when he walked into her building in a flannel shirt with grease still under his fingernails, carrying a canvas tool roll instead of a briefcase. She gave him 10 minutes to look at the clock and tell her honestly whether it was even worth attempting. He didn't say a word for nearly 2 hours. He examined the gears under magnification, cross-referenced maintenance sketches from the original workshop, and traced every fracture with the tip of a fine brush like he was reading a language only he understood. When he finally spoke, he laid out a restoration plan so exact that even Vivian's most senior consultant admitted, reluctantly, that it might actually work. For the next 17 days, Daniel barely left the building. Ivy did her homework in a corner of the workshop they gave him, occasionally walking over with granola bars, because she'd learned that when her father disappeared into a repair like this, he forgot to eat entirely. Staff who passed by started slowing down to watch him work, not because they were told to, but because what he was doing looked less like labor and more like resurrection. On the 17th night, at nearly midnight, the clock's hands moved for the first time in over a century of near total silence. Every specialist who examined it afterward said the same thing. It wasn't just repaired, it was better than new. But when Daniel submitted his final invoice, the number that came back from Vivian's finance office was less than half of what they'd verbally agreed. Her legal team claimed the original quote had been a preliminary estimate, not a binding contract, and that an independent contractor without a signed retainer had little ground to argue otherwise. Daniel sat across from Vivian's assistant, said nothing for a long moment, then quietly packed his tools and walked out. He didn't threaten to sue. He didn't raise his voice. He just went home, sat at his kitchen table, and stared at a stack of overdue bills he now had no way of covering. Ivy noticed immediately that something was wrong. She climbed into the chair beside him, put her small hand over his, and asked if the clock hadn't liked him after all. He told her the clock liked him just fine. It was the person who owned it that was the problem. 2 days before the gala, Ashford & Cole's senior appraisal team gathered to formally certify the restored piece for auction, standard procedure required before anything of that value could be sold. One by one, every appraiser in the room declined to sign. They said the same thing in different words. They couldn't, in good conscience, certify the integrity of a restoration when the restorer himself had been treated with that kind of dishonesty, because provenance isn't just about the object. It's about trust in the people who touched it. Without certification, the clock legally could not go to auction. Word moved through the antiques and Horology whirled faster than Vivian could contain it. Other specialists began quietly declining Ashford and Cole's calls. A rival house reportedly reached out to Daniel directly, offering him a permanent contract on the spot. The gala, the one worth $40 million, was postponed indefinitely, and every hour of delay meant panicked calls from consigners, threatening to pull their pieces entirely. For the first time since taking over the company, Vivian watched her own authority mean absolutely nothing. Her board wanted answers. Her father, retired but still watching from a distance, wanted to know how she'd let a repair dispute become the biggest crisis in company history. One evening, unannounced and without her usual security, Vivian drove to the address on Daniel's old invoice. She expected to find anger waiting for her. Instead, she found him in the driveway, sleeves rolled up, helping Ivy build a tiny working pendulum out of a coat hanger and a fishing weight for a school science project, both of them laughing every time it swung crooked. There was no bitterness in that driveway, no performance for her benefit, just a tired, brilliant man giving his daughter everything he had left after a long day. Vivian stood at the end of the driveway for almost a full minute before either of them noticed her. She didn't say much that night, but something in her had cracked quietly, the same way that antique clock face once had. The next morning, she called an emergency meeting with her full board and legal team. In front of all of them, she admitted she'd been wrong. Not just about the invoice, but about what kind of company she wanted to run. She authorized full payment immediately, added a bonus that covered Ivy's entire next year of school fees, and personally called every appraiser who had walked out to apologize. Ashford and Cole announced a new binding contract policy for every independent specialist they worked with going forward. No exceptions, no fine print. If this story has moved you even a little, take a moment to like this video. Drop a comment telling us if you believe skilled work deserves respect no matter who's doing it, and subscribe to Hidden Justice for more stories like this one. The rescheduled gala went ahead 3 weeks later. The astronomical clock sold for a record price, and the auctioneer paused before the final bid to publicly credit the restorer by name, something that almost never happens in that industry. Daniel didn't attend. He was home, helping Ivy glue the last piece onto her science fair pendulum. The real one, not the coat hanger version. Vivian changed more than her contracts that year. She changed how she walked into every room after that, understanding finally that the people whose names never make the headlines are usually the ones actually holding everything together. Years later, when Ivy herself apprenticed under a master horologist and eventually opened her own restoration studio, she kept one thing on the wall above her workbench: the original rejected invoice from Ashford and Cole, framed not out of bitterness, but as a reminder that her father had been offered less than he was worth, and had still done the work with everything he had. Comment the words "quiet strength" if you believe the people who do the work in silence deserve to be seen, because in the end, empires are built from marble and money, but they only stand because someone with grease under their fingernails did their job right when nobody was watching, and eventually that always gets noticed.